In the autumn of 1856, in the rural expanse of Medina County, Ohio, local authorities uncovered a discovery so horrifying that newspapers refused to publish details for nearly 3 decades. Beneath the Grimby family's home, intended as a refuge for orphaned children, lay evidence that challenged the community's understanding of charity, family, and the very nature of evil. 20-3 small, unmarked graves, hastily dug, contained the remains of children supposedly sent to families. In the West, their names were meticulously erased from all official records. The Grimby family, pillars of the Methodist community and recipients of state funding for their charitable work, were running something far more sinister than an orphanage. Before diving deeper into the Grimby family's House of Horrors, if you're intrigued by these dark chapters of American history, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And let us know in the comments which state you're tuning in from. Stories like this have unfolded in small towns across the country. This discovery remained buried in county archives for generations, too unsettling for a young nation still grappling with its moral foundations. In the turbulent decade before the Civil War, in 1856, Medina County sat at the crossroads of America's westward expansion, where New England's Puritan values clashed with the harsh pragmatism of frontier life. Founded just 3 decades earlier, the county was home to a sparse population of 8,000. Scattered across dense forests and modest farming settlements, most families struggled to survive on Ohio's unforgiving soil, with harsh winters regularly claiming the lives of the elderly and infirm. The Grimby Home for Wayward Children stood 3 miles from Medina's county seat, accessible only by a narrow dirt road winding through thick oak and maple groves. Established in 1851 by Jeremiah and Martha Grimby, the home earned a reputation as a beacon of Christian charity in northeastern Ohio. Jeremiah, a tall, stern man with piercing gray eyes and prematurely white hair, arrived from Vermont with impeccable references from religious leaders. His wife, Martha, petite and nervous, with quick, darting movements, rarely spoke above a whisper but was known for her apparent devotion to the children in their care. Their adult son, Caleb Grimby, assisted in managing the orphanage at 28. Caleb shared his father's imposing stature but possessed an unsettling strength that unnerved even longtime neighbors. His pale blue eyes seemed to notice every movement, every expression, every weakness. Unlike his parents, who maintained a veneer of pious respectability, Caleb made little effort to conceal his contempt for those he deemed weak or unworthy. To outsiders, the Grimby operation appeared exemplary. Annual state inspectors consistently praised the family's dedication to caring for Ohio's most vulnerable children. The Grimby home received funding from both state coffers and private Methodist sponsors, money supposedly used for food, clothing, education, and medical care for the 30 to 40 children residing there. The home's uniqueness lay in its specialization in helping children with challenging backgrounds, those deemed problematic in other institutions with physical deformities or whose traumatic pasts made them withdrawn and distrustful of adults. Other orphanages eagerly sent their most difficult cases to the Grimbys, praising their patience and apparent success in rehabilitating troubled children. The children arriving at Grimby came from across Ohio and beyond, victims of cholera epidemics sweeping Cincinnati and Cleveland, survivors of fires and industrial accidents, or children from families torn apart by poverty or alcoholism. Many arrived with little more than the clothes on their backs and memories they desperately wished to forget. The Grimbys seemed to welcome these broken souls with open arms, promising safety, education, and eventual placement in loving families. Heading west to claim land. Yet, locals occasionally remarked on the eerie silence surrounding the Grimby home. Unlike other children's institutions where laughter and play could be heard from the road, the Grimby property was almost funereally quiet. When questioned, Jeremiah explained that his children were taught discipline and respect, qualities essential for their future success as productive citizens. This explanation satisfied most inquiries, particularly those who preferred not to pry too deeply into their community's charitable efforts. The first crack in the Grimby facade appeared in late September 1856 when a traveling photographer, Edmund Hartwell, arrived in Medina County to document regional institutions for a study commissioned by Ohio's Department of Public Welfare. Hartwell, a meticulous man from Cincinnati known for his thoroughness, had already photographed dozens of schools, almshouses, and orphanages across the state. His photographs were to illustrate a comprehensive report on the condition of Ohio's dependent populations, a progressive endeavor positioning Ohio at the forefront of social reform. On a cool Thursday morning, Hartwell loaded his bulky camera equipment onto a rented wagon and set out for the Grimby home. His driver, a local named Tom Bradshaw, had never visited the orphanage despite living in the area for 15 years. "Strange how it's always so quiet there," Bradshaw remarked. As they navigated the rutted road, "My wife says she's never seen the kids playing outside, not once in all their years of operation." As they approached the property, Hartwell immediately noticed the main building, a large, three-story structure painted an uninviting gray, with small windows that seemed designed to keep out the world rather than let in light. Behind it stood a smaller building, presumably for staff quarters, connected by a covered walkway. The grounds themselves were in a grim state, no toys, swings, or any signs of childish activity. Jeremiah Grimby greeted them at the front door, his towering frame filling the entrance as he scrutinized Hartwell's credentials with obvious displeasure. "We weren't expecting any official visits," he said, his voice commanding and unyielding, like a man unaccustomed to interruptions. "Our children are in lessons, and I'd prefer not to disrupt their studies for unnecessary photographs." Hartwell, experienced in dealing with reluctant administrators, presented his official authorization from the state capitol. "I assure you, Mr. Grimby, this is entirely routine. I only need to document your facilities and perhaps photograph a few children at their studies." Nothing intrusive. Negotiations lasted nearly 20 minutes, during which Hartwell grew increasingly aware of the absolute silence emanating from the supposedly occupied building. No footsteps, no voices, no sounds at all. When he remarked on this, Martha Grimby appeared beside her husband, wringing her hands nervously. "Our children are very disciplined," she whispered. "They know not to disturb lessons." Eventually, Jeremiah relented, but on strict terms. Hartwell could photograph the main classroom and dining hall, but only when empty. He was not to speak directly with the children, and Caleb would accompany him to ensure he stayed within approved areas. "Some of our children have endured terrible traumas," Jeremiah explained. "Unexpected encounters with strangers can trigger fits of hysteria that take days to subside." The interior of the building struck Hartwell as more prison than orphanage. From the main entrance, long, narrow corridors stretched in both directions, lined with heavy wooden doors bearing no markings or windows. The walls were devoid of decoration, no children's drawings, no cheerful posters, nothing to suggest a place where youth lived and learned. The air carried a strange mix of pine, disinfectant, and something organic, unpleasant, that Hartwell couldn't quite identify. Caleb first led him to the classroom, a large room on the second floor furnished with 30 wooden desks arranged in neat rows. Each desk, identical, held a slate and chalk, facing a simple wooden podium at the front. "Where are the children's personal belongings?" Hartwell asked, noting the complete absence of books, papers, or any trace of individual students. "We maintain strict organization," Caleb replied, his eyes fixed on Hartwell's face. "Personal items lead to theft and fights. Everything they need is provided as required." As Hartwell set up his equipment, he heard faint sounds from somewhere deep within the building, not the cheerful noise of playing children, but something more disturbing: soft moans, an occasional cough, and what sounded like quiet sobs. When he mentioned the sounds, Caleb's expression hardened. "Some of our residents are unwell," he said curtly. "We have a small infirmary for those needing medical attention." The dining hall on the first floor was equally unsettling. Long wooden tables with attached benches could seat about 40, but the room resembled a military mess hall more than a place where children ate. The serving area was a simple counter with large pots and ladles, showing no signs of varied meals or consideration for individual preferences. Most troubling was the complete lack of wear or mess that would suggest regular use by dozens of children. As Hartwell prepared to photograph the dining hall, he made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. While adjusting his camera's angle, he dropped a lens cover which rolled under one of the long tables. Reaching to retrieve it, his hand brushed against something carved into the wooden bench. Small letters scratched into the surface, likely with a nail or sharp stone. In the dim light filtering through the small windows, he could just make out the words, "Help us." The disturbing encounter at the Grimby home deeply troubled Edmund Hartwell, but it was 3 weeks before he could act on his suspicions. Back in Cincinnati, he was swamped with routine tasks, developing photographs and preparing his official report. Yet the memory of that carved plea, the unnatural silence of the institution, and the family's evident efforts to conceal something gnawed at his conscience. Hartwell's first attempt at investigation leveraged his professional network. He contacted colleagues who had photographed other Ohio orphanages, probing their experiences and what they considered normal operations. Without exception, they described lively, noisy institutions where children's voices were audible during visits, with ample evidence of play, learning, and administrators eager to showcase their charges' success stories. Increasingly alarmed, Hartwell reached out to Ohio's Department of Public Welfare, specifically to an official named Samuel Hutchins, who oversaw orphanage inspections. Their conversation, held over lunch at a Cincinnati tavern, revealed troubling gaps in oversight of the Grimby operation. They never seemed to have any issues: no illnesses, no outbreaks, no disciplinary problems, no requests for additional funding or support, Hutchins explained, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "In 15 years of working with these institutions, I've never seen one run so smoothly." When Hartwell pressed for details about annual inspections, Hutchins winced. "That's just it. The inspections are always perfect to perfect. If you ask me, every child accounted for, records immaculate, facilities spotless." He paused, glancing around the tavern as if checking for eavesdroppers. "I've never seen the same child twice during my visits, and when I ask about specific children from past years, there's always an explanation placed with families out west, sent to relatives, that sort of thing." This revelation prompted Hartwell to dig deeper into placement records. He uncovered a pattern so consistent it defied statistical probability. According to official documents, the Grimby home had successfully placed 127 children with families over the past 5 years, an exceptional rate that was the envy of similar institutions across Ohio. However, all placements were described as with farming families in territories west of Ohio, with locations so vague they were impossible to verify. Even more alarming was the complete absence of follow-up correspondence other orphanages regularly received. Letters from placed children or their new families, updates on their progress, requests for additional medical or educational records. The Grimby home's archives contained no such correspondence, not a single letter from any of the 127 children they claimed to have successfully placed. Hartwell's investigation began to consume his thoughts and time. He spent evenings in Cincinnati pubs, eavesdropping on conversations among travelers, wagon drivers, and merchants who regularly traded along western routes. His casual inquiries about families adopting orphans from Ohio institutions yielded troubling results. Several individuals recalled transporting children west from other orphanages, but none could recall any involvement with the Grimby operation. A breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While reviewing photographs in his darkroom, Hartwell noticed something he had missed during his visit. In the background of one dining hall image, barely discernible in the shadows near a window, was a small face, a child's, pressed against the glass, eyes wide with terror. The image was grainy and unclear, but undeniably human and desperate. This discovery spurred Hartwell to return to Medina County, this time approaching the investigation differently. Instead of confronting the Grimbys directly, he spent time in the county seat, discreetly questioning longtime residents about what they knew of the orphanage and its operations. What he learned painted a disturbing picture of willful community ignorance. Sarah Kellerman, a shopkeeper who had lived in the area since 1840, admitted she always found the Grimbys' activities odd. They never buy children's clothes or toys, she told Hartwell in a quiet moment at her store. When they do buy supplies, it's always adult-sized portions, cleaning supplies, and she hesitated, glancing at the door. They buy a lot of lime, more than any farmstead would need. Always have it delivered straight to their place, never pick it up themselves. Dr. Marcus Tilton, the county physician, provided another piece of the puzzle. Despite being the only doctor within 20 miles of the Grimby home, he had never been called to treat any of their children. In 10 years of practice in this county, I've treated injuries and illnesses at every farm, school, and institution around, he told Hartwell, except that orphanage. The Grimbys claim their children are in perfect health, no flu, no broken bones, no childhood diseases, nothing. Medically, that's impossible. The mounting evidence compelled Hartwell to take bolder action. In mid-November 1856, he resolved to conduct covert surveillance of the Grimby home, hoping to document the children's presence and activities. He positioned himself in a grove of trees about 200 yards from the main building, armed with a borrowed Union Army telescope. What he observed over 3 days of intermittent surveillance shattered any remaining hopes of the Grimby operations. Legitimacy, the home showed none of the expected rhythms of life for an institution housing dozens of children. No laundry on the lines despite 30 or more residents, no signs of cooking on the scale needed for such a population. Most alarming, not a single child emerged outdoors during daylight hours. The only consistent activity Hartwell observed was deeply disturbing. Each evening, just after sunset, Caleb Grimby emerged from the main building carrying what appeared to be bundles wrapped in tarpaulin or burlap. The bundles, varying in size but many disturbingly small, were loaded onto a cart and transported to an area behind the staff quarters where the estate's boundaries faded into dense forest. On the third night of surveillance, Hartwell witnessed an event that convinced him to seek official intervention immediately. Shortly after midnight, he noticed moving lights in the wooded area where Caleb regularly took his mysterious bundles. The lights' lanterns or torches moved systematically, suggesting organized activity rather than random nighttime labor. This continued for nearly 2 hours, accompanied by faint sounds carried on the still air, rhythmic thuds of tools striking earth, the scrape of shovels, and occasional voices distant to discern but unmistakably urgent. Hartwell's decision to approach Sheriff William Bradenton proved more challenging than anticipated. Bradenton, a political appointee more comfortable with tax disputes than criminal investigations, initially dismissed Hartwell's concerns as the overactive imagination of a city man unfamiliar with rural life. At their first meeting, Bradenton emphasized the Grimbys' standing in the community. They've been caring for unfortunate children for years without a single complaint, he said. However, Hartwell's persistence, combined with his photographs and documented accounts from locals, eventually forced Bradenton to act. The sheriff's reluctance became more understandable when Hartwell learned that Jeremiah Grimby had chaired the county committee that recommended Bradenton's appointment 3 years earlier. The ensuing investigation uncovered a complex web of political and social connections that had shielded the Grimbys' activities for years. Jeremiah was a member of 3 Methodist church boards, donated generously to local political campaigns, and corresponded with state legislators on child welfare policies. His wife, Martha, was involved in various women's charitable societies, always ready to speak passionately about the family's devotion to caring for society's most vulnerable. Most crucially, the Grimby home's success in placing children with Western families was a point of pride for county officials. State inspectors routinely cited the institution as evidence of Ohio's progressive approach to child welfare, and politicians frequently referenced the Grimby success in speeches about social reform, any investigation exposing issues with. The operation would cast a shadow over everyone who had endorsed or supported it. Bradenton opted for a compromise, agreeing to conduct what he called a thorough but discreet investigation. Instead of arriving with deputies and search warrants, he planned to visit the Grimby home unannounced, ostensibly to discuss routine county business, but actually to assess the situation firsthand. Hartwell was to accompany him as a technical consultant, with his photographic equipment providing a legitimate pretext for documenting any irregularities. The visit, conducted on a gray December morning with heavy clouds threatening snow, immediately confirmed Hartwell's worst suspicions. The Grimby family's reaction to their unannounced arrival was barely concealed panic. Jeremiah, usually composed and authoritative, stammered as he explained why the building seemed so empty and quiet. Martha vanished entirely after initial greetings, claiming urgent kitchen duties that couldn't be delayed. Most telling was Caleb's behavior. The younger Grimby, typically volatile but controlled, appeared on the verge of physical violence during the visit. His hands visibly trembled as he guided them through the same areas Hartwell had photographed months earlier, and his responses to casual questions grew increasingly erratic and hostile. When Sheriff Bradenton remarked on the unnatural silence in a building supposedly housing dozens of children, Caleb's explanation was elaborate and clearly rehearsed. The children are observing a day of silent reflection as part of their moral training, a practice rooted in Quaker traditions of contemplative worship. The sheriff's growing suspicions led to an unprecedented demand. He insisted on meeting the children, despite their supposed silent reflection requirements. This request prompted the three Grimbys to hold a whispered family conference by the main staircase while Bradenton and Hartwell waited in the parlor. What followed was a carefully staged performance that raised more questions than it answered. The Grimbys led their visitors to a large room on the second floor where about 20 children sat in complete silence at individual desks. The children, aged roughly 6 to 15, maintained an unnatural stillness and avoided eye contact with the visitors when Bradenton attempted to speak directly to several of them, asking simple questions about their names and how long they had been at the home. Their responses were barely audible whispers, sounding more coerced than spontaneous. Hartwell noticed several alarming details during this encounter. Many children showed signs of poor health, sunken cheeks, pallid complexions, and a general listlessness suggesting malnutrition. More disturbing were visible injuries on some, bandages on arms and hands, healing cuts on faces, and, in one case, finger-shaped bruises on a girl's neck. When Hartwell attempted to photograph the group, Jeremiah intervened, claiming the children were too traumatized by past experiences to tolerate being photographed by strangers. The most chilling moment came when a boy, about 10 years old, seated at the back, locked eyes with Hartwell. The child's face radiated desperate hope, as if he recognized these visitors as his only chance for rescue. He began to raise his hand, seemingly to speak, but Caleb swiftly positioned himself behind the boy's chair. The child immediately lowered his hand and stared back at his desk, trembling with what appeared to be terror. As they prepared to leave, Hartwell made a strategic decision that proved pivotal in breaking the case open. He deliberately left behind a lens-cleaning cloth, giving him an excuse to return to the building an hour later. When he knocked, claiming he needed to retrieve the item, Martha Grimby answered alone. Jeremiah and Caleb had urgently left for town. Martha's demeanor without her male relatives revealed a woman on the brink of a complete nervous breakdown. Her hands shook uncontrollably, her speech was rapid and disjointed, and she seemed unable to focus on even simple conversation. When Hartwell asked about retrieving his cloth from the classroom, she broke down in tears, apologizing repeatedly for something she couldn't explain. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she whispered, glancing fearfully toward the staircase as if expecting her husband or son to appear. "When we started, Jeremiah said we were helping them. He said the weak suffer and we'd end there. Suffering, but then it became something else. Before Hartwell could respond to this alarming admission, the sound of approaching horses sent Martha into a panic. She quickly composed herself, warned Hartwell never to repeat their conversation, and retrieved his cloth from upstairs. By the time Jeremiah and Caleb returned, Martha had reverted to her usual withdrawn silence, and Hartwell left with information that turned the investigation on its head, the realization that the Grimbys were ending children's suffering rather than caring for them prompted Sheriff Bradenton to seek assistance from state authorities. However, the political implications of investigating such a respected institution meant external help would be slow to arrive, if it came at all. Meanwhile, Hartwell's growing certainty that children were being actively harmed at the Grimby home made waiting for bureaucratic processes unthinkable. When we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Medina County deepens. If this story sends chills down your spine, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit the like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to catch more stories like this. Let's uncover what happens next together. The decision to conduct a covert nighttime investigation came after Hartwell's fourth surveillance of the Grimby home, where he witnessed actions that left no doubt of the family's criminal intent. On the night of December 15, 1856, he observed Caleb emerge from the main building carrying what was unmistakably a child's body, small, limp, wrapped in tarpaulin, loaded onto the familiar cart for transport to the wooded area. Sheriff Bradenton's raid on the Grimby home for wayward children began before dawn on December 18, 1856, armed with hastily obtained warrants and accompanied by 3 deputies seconded from neighboring counties. Bradenton approached the home as morning fog lifted from the frozen ground. The timing of the raid was strategic, early enough to prevent evidence destruction, but late enough to avoid the political fallout of a nighttime assault on a prominent family. Deputy Sheriff Thomas Connolly, seconded from Cuyahoga County, had participated in numerous arrests, but later described approaching the Grimby home as uniquely unsettling. The usual sounds of morning activity, roosters crowing, livestock stirring, smoke rising from chimneys, were entirely absent from the orphanage grounds. Even winter birds seemed to avoid the place, creating an unnatural silence where every hoofbeat echoed louder in the frosty air. As they dismounted near the main building, Hartwell noticed fresh wagon tracks leading from the house to the woods beyond the estate. The tracks were deep, indicating heavy loads, and appeared to have been made within the past few hours. Even more alarming were dark stains in the snow along the trail, later identified by Dr. Tilton as human blood. The Grimbys' reaction, too. The arrival of armed lawmen confirmed their guilt more convincingly than any evidence. Through a window, Jeremiah, typically composed and authoritative, could be seen frantically throwing papers into the parlor fireplace. When Deputy Connolly pounded on the door, demanding entry in the name of Medina County law, the sounds of destruction continued for nearly 2 minutes before Jeremiah finally opened the door. His appearance shocked even Sheriff Bradenton, who had known him for years. Jeremiah's usually impeccable clothing was disheveled and stained, his white hair wild and unkempt, and his hands, gripping the doorframe, trembled visibly. Most disturbing were his eyes, once cold and calculating, now darting feverishly between the assembled officers, as if searching for a non-existent escape. "Gentlemen, this is wholly unacceptable," Jeremiah stammered, his voice quivering with strain. "We are a respected institution, endorsed by the state itself. Surely any concerns could have been addressed through proper channels, not this intrusion." Bradenton pushed past him into the entryway, immediately noting the acrid smell of burning paper and ash scattered around the fireplace. "Jeremiah Grimby, you are under arrest on suspicion of child cruelty, fraud, and murder. Where are Martha and Caleb?" The question elicited a wail from somewhere deep within the house. Martha's high-pitched, piercing voice cried out words that chilled everyone present. The children in the ground know. They know what we did. God forgive us, they know. Martha was found in the kitchen, collapsed on the floor beside an overturned chair, sobbing incoherently and clutching a blood-stained apron. Her condition was so severe that Dr. Tilton, accompanying the raiding party, immediately administered laudanum to prevent her from harming herself in her hysteria. Through her sobs, she repeatedly confessed to helping them sleep forever, begging forgiveness for following Jeremiah's horrific plan. The most dramatic moment came with Caleb's attempt to flee through a second-story rear window. Deputy Sheriff Samuel Pierce, stationed behind the building for this purpose, saw the younger Grimby climbing down, carrying a heavy canvas bag. When Pierce shouted for him to stop, Caleb dropped to the ground and ran toward the woods, but was apprehended after a brief chase ending in a frozen creek bed. The canvas bag Caleb tried to save contained the most damning evidence in the case. Detailed records of the family's activities over the past 5 years, including maps of burial sites, inventories of murdered children's belongings, and, most horrifically, a ledger documenting the sale of children's possessions to unsuspecting merchants in distant cities. The search of the main building began with Bradenton and Deputy Connolly inspecting the first floor, while Hartwell documented the scene with his camera. The parlor, usually kept pristine for visitors, showed clear signs of recent panic. The fireplace held partially burned documents, including fragments of official correspondence with state authorities and what appeared to be financial reports detailing payments received for individual children. Among the salvaged documents was a partially destroyed letter from Ohio's Department of Public Welfare, dated 6 months earlier, praising the Grimby home's exceptional success in placing children and recommending increased state funding. The bitter irony of this official endorsement, found amid a search for evidence of mass murder, later became a symbol of the system's catastrophic failure to protect vulnerable children. The dining hall revealed evidence of systematic deception that had misled inspectors for years. Beneath the main counter, officers found hidden sets of plates, cups, and utensils that could be quickly arranged to set tables for dozens of children. However, the items were virtually unworn, showing no signs of regular use. Even more telling were the food supplies in the adjacent pantry, sufficient for perhaps 8 people for a month, but woefully inadequate for the 30 or more children supposedly residing there. Dr. Tilton's inspection of the kitchen uncovered further evidence of the Grimby's deceit. The kitchen facilities, while adequate for preparing meals for inspectors or a small family, could not support the regular feeding of dozens of growing children. The absence of large-scale cooking equipment, multiple work surfaces, or storage for bulk ingredients contradicted every claim about the home's operations. The second-floor search revealed a staged classroom used to create the illusion of a functioning educational institution. The classroom, where 20 children were observed during the prior visit, was an elaborate theatrical set, while the desks were arranged to suggest regular use. They bore no personal items, no completed school work, no trace of individual students. Even more alarming, upon inspection, many desks were found bolted to the floor, presumably to prevent disruption during hastily arranged inspections. In a storage closet beside the classroom, officers discovered costumes and props used to create the illusion of a larger student body. Several sets of children's clothing in various sizes could be quickly distributed to simulate different children during different inspections. Wigs, makeup, and even crude disguises indicated that the same core group of children was repeatedly used to impersonate different students for visiting officials. The discovery of a basement entrance hidden behind a false wall in the kitchen pantry marked the moment suspicion turned to confirmed horror. Deputy Pierce later described the unbearable stench that rose from the basement when the hidden door was first opened: a mix of human waste and washed bodies, infection, and something indescribable that spoke of unimaginable suffering. The basement itself was a monument to systematic cruelty. 20 children, aged 7 to 16, were found locked in a space originally designed for root vegetable storage. Measuring roughly 20 by 15 feet, the room had no heat, no ventilation, no natural light. A single bucket in one corner served as the only sanitation facility for all 20 children, while another contained water, so foul Dr. Tilton later deemed it unfit for animals. The children's condition horrified even seasoned lawmen, most were too weak to stand unaided, their bodies bearing clear signs of prolonged starvation. Their clothing, what little remained, was tattered and offered no protection against the basement's constant damp and cold. Several had severe infections from untreated wounds, while others bore marks of systematic beatings, bruises in various stages of healing, improperly set fractures, and scars indicating repeated abuse over months or years. Dr. Tilton's immediate medical assessment revealed the full extent of the horror. These children weren't merely neglected, he reported to Sheriff Bradenton while treating the most severe cases. They were systematically tortured and starved. Several bare marks of deliberate burns, cuts from sharp objects, and injuries consistent with repeated beatings. Most disturbing, the injuries appear to have been inflicted over an extended period. This wasn't sudden violence, but calculated, prolonged torture. Most heartbreaking was how the children reacted to their rescuers. Instead of relief or gratitude, most expressed terror at the sight of adult men. Some cowered in corners, begging not to be harmed, while others seemed catatonic from their trauma. Several older children tried to shield the younger ones, forming a living barrier with their weakened bodies, a behavior suggesting months or years of shared suffering and mutual protection against unimaginable cruelty. Among the rescued was the boy who had locked eyes with Hartwell during their earlier visit, whose attempt to seek help had been silenced by Caleb's threatening presence. Barely conscious and weighing roughly half what he should for his age, the boy managed to whisper words that shed light on the Grimby's methods. They choose who dies next. They make us watch. The basement also held evidence of the Grimby's systematic record-keeping, which proved critical during the trial. Hidden beneath loose floorboards were journals and ledgers documenting not only the arrival and disposal of children, but also detailed observations of their behavior, health, and what Jeremiah called their fitness for continued existence. The journals suggested the operation had initially been a legitimate child care effort. Early entries from 1851 described genuine attempts to place children with foster families, including correspondence and follow-up visits. Jeremiah's handwriting from that period conveyed pride in successful placements and concern for the children's welfare. However, by late 1852, the tone and content of the records shifted dramatically, coinciding with financial difficulties and increasing pressure to accommodate more children than the facility could handle. Children began to be described as burdens, draining resources, and unlikely to achieve productive adulthood. By 1853, the journals explicitly referred to practical solutions to the problem of defective specimens consuming resources, better allocated to those deemed worthy. Most chilling were the detailed criteria the family developed to determine which children would live or die. The records revealed a systematic evaluation process based on physical appearance, perceived intelligence, obedience to authority, and what Caleb termed moral potential. Children who scored poorly on these arbitrary metrics were gradually reduced in rations, denied medical care, and eventually selected for disposal. The journals documented 127 children who passed through the Grimby home over its 5 years of operation. Of those, only the 20 found in the basement survived. The fate of the remaining 107 was recorded with scientific precision, dates of death, methods used, and burial locations, all documented with the clinical detachment of a livestock inventory. Caleb's personal notebooks, recovered during his attempted escape, shed disturbing light on the psychology behind the killings. His writings revealed a young man convinced of his unique ability to identify genetic and moral defects in children. He described his murders not as killings but as calling for societal improvement and mercy toward those incapable of productive lives. The discovery of the burial ground behind the staff quarters provided the physical evidence that elevated the investigation from suspected cruelty to confirmed mass murder. Excavations conducted over 3 days under Dr. Tilton's supervision uncovered 23 graves hastily dug and dusted with lime to hasten decomposition. The systematic nature of the burial's graves arranged in neat rows, each marked with a simple numbered wooden stake, indicated the killings were planned and organized. Not spontaneous acts of violence, the bodies bore evidence of prolonged abuse before death. Many had healed fractures, signs of starvation, and marks of systematic torture. Several of the youngest children appeared to have died from starvation and exposure rather than direct violence, while others showed signs of active killing, strangulation, blunt trauma, and, in 2 cases, apparent poisoning. Hartwell's documentation of the excavations produced some of the earliest forensic photographs used in an American criminal trial. His meticulous recording of each burial site, the positioning of bodies, and personal items found with some children provided irrefutable evidence of the crime's systematic nature. The photographs captured not only the graves but also small treasures buried with the children's homemade toys, unsent letters to relatives, and scraps of fabric that were their only links to lives before the Grimby home. Among the most heartbreaking discoveries were the children's attempts to record their fallen companions. Hidden in the basement were names and dates carved into wooden support beams and scratched into stone walls, a memorial created by survivors to remember their murdered friends. These markings became critical evidence in identifying victims and establishing a timeline of the killings. Interrogations of the captured Grimbys revealed the full scope of their crimes and the psychology that enabled such systematic atrocities. Jeremiah, faced with overwhelming evidence, initially maintained his innocence but gradually shifted to justifying his actions. In his final confession, given after days of questioning, he framed the murders as a form of social service intended to prevent suffering and improve society by eliminating defective individuals. His rationale drew on contemporary theories of heredity and social improvement gaining traction in certain intellectual circles. Jeremiah claimed to have studied European theorists advocating selective breeding and the elimination of the unfit as means of enhancing human society. He argued that the children they killed were mercifully spared lives of suffering and dependency, consuming resources better used for healthy, productive citizens. Martha's confession, given between bouts of hysteria and religious mania, provided the most disturbing insights into how the family transitioned from caregivers to killers. She described how Jeremiah's initial frustration with difficult children evolved into a philosophical conviction that society was obligated to eliminate those unable to contribute to the common good. Her testimony revealed her initial resistance to the killings but eventual persuasion by her husband's arguments and her son's apparent confidence in identifying defective children. Most alarming was Martha's description of the killing process. Rather than swift executions, the Grimbys developed a systematic method of gradual elimination that allowed plausible explanations for the children's deaths. Selected children were isolated from the others, given reduced rations, denied medical care for injuries or illnesses, and subjected to increasingly frequent abuse until they succumbed to a combination of starvation, disease, and trauma. Caleb's interrogation proved the most challenging for investigators, as he expressed no remorse and refused to acknowledge his actions as criminal. His responses revealed a young man wholly convinced of his righteousness, and frustrated that others failed to see the necessity of his work. He described the killings as scientific culling and expressed regret only that he couldn't operate on a larger scale. His detailed accounts of how he evaluated children for elimination revealed a systematic process based on physical appearance. behavioral observations, and arbitrary assessments of intelligence and moral worth. Children with physical disabilities, developmental delays, defiance of authority, or simply deemed unattractive by his standards were sentenced to death. He kept meticulous records of each child's defects and used this information to convince his parents that elimination was not only justified but necessary for society's good. Most terrifying was Caleb's clinical, truthful description of the psychological torture he inflicted on selected children before killing them. He isolated his victims, told them directly they would die because they were worthless, and forced them to watch as he killed others. He explained that this process served both to break their resistance and to provide entertainment during long winter months when outdoor work was impossible. The revelation that some killings were performed as public spectacles for the surviving children added further horror to the case. According to the rescued children's testimony, Caleb occasionally gathered the entire group to witness executions, using them as both entertainment and a warning against disobedience. The survivors' accounts of these forced viewings became some of the most devastating testimony against the family during the trial. The trial of the Grimby family began on March 15, 1857, in the Medina County Courthouse and quickly became the most sensational criminal trial in Ohio's history at the time. The case drew attention from newspapers across the Midwest and Northeast, with reporters traveling from as far as New York and Boston to cover what many called the most horrific crimes ever tried in American courts. Judge Harrison Wickham, specially appointed to preside over the case due to its complexity and notoriety, faced the challenge of conducting a fair trial while managing unprecedented public interest and outrage. The courthouse, designed to seat about 50 spectators, was overwhelmed by crowds numbering in the hundreds who gathered daily hoping to witness the proceedings. Special arrangements were made to accommodate visiting journalists and ensure the defendants' safety, as they required protection from lynch mobs assembling each morning outside the courthouse. The prosecution, led by County Prosecutor Samuel Morrison, with support from specially appointed prosecutors from the state capitol, faced the task of presenting evidence so horrific that some questioned whether it could be discussed publicly. The decision to admit Hartwell's photographs as evidence marked one of the first instances of photographic documentation in an American criminal trial, setting a precedent that influenced judicial procedures for decades. The photographs themselves were so shocking that Judge Wickham ordered the courtroom cleared of women and children before they could be displayed. Even seasoned lawyers and journalists found the images difficult to view. The photographs of the basement prison, the excavated graves, and the condition of the rescued children provided irrefutable evidence of the family's crimes that no testimony could convey as powerfully. Dr. Tilton's medical testimony provided critical evidence of the systematic nature of the abuse and the deliberate methods used to kill the children. His detailed descriptions of injuries found on both living and deceased children, corroborated by written medical reports, demonstrated that the deaths were not accidental or impulsive, but the result of calculated torture designed to inflict maximum suffering over time. The testimony of the rescued children proved the most emotionally powerful evidence presented during the trial. Some of the older survivors, despite their trauma, were able to provide detailed accounts of life in the Grimby basement and bear witness to specific murders they were forced to observe. Their descriptions of the family's methods, the psychological torture inflicted on victims, and the systematic nature of the selection process provided the prosecution with evidence that corroborated the physical findings and documentary records. One of the most compelling witnesses was Margaret Henley, a 13-year-old girl who had survived nearly 2 years in the Grimby basement. Despite her ordeal, Margaret maintained remarkable composure and clarity in recounting the horrors she witnessed. Her testimony about young children dying from starvation and abuse, delivered in a clear, steady voice that contrasted sharply with Her emaciated appearance reduced many trial observers to tears. Margaret's description of Caleb's selection process proved particularly devastating to the defense. She testified that he regularly inspected the children like livestock, checking their teeth, observing their behavior, and making notes in his journals about their fitness for continued existence. Children showing signs of illness, disability, or defiance were marked for elimination in a process that could last weeks or months, involving gradual starvation and escalating abuse. The defense strategy, hampered by overwhelming evidence against their clients, largely focused on claims of mental instability and religious delusion. Jaramir's attorney, William Henderson of Cleveland, argued that his client had been driven insane by the overwhelming burden of caring for society's most traumatized children. The stress of running an underfunded institution, combined with the traumatic histories of his charges, supposedly triggered a mental breakdown that left him unable to distinguish right from wrong. Martha's defense, led by attorney James Patterson, leaned heavily on claims of female weakness and domination by her male relatives. Patterson argued that Martha was under the psychological control of her husband and son, lacking the mental capacity to resist their influence or comprehend the criminal nature of their actions. Her evident mental collapse during and after her arrest was presented as evidence of her fundamental inability to meaningfully participate in planning or committing the crimes. Caleb's defense proved the most challenging, as his detailed records and lack of remorse made claims of insanity difficult to sustain. His attorney, Robert Chase, attempted to argue that his client's actions, though extreme, were grounded in legitimate scientific theories about societal improvement and selection gaining traction in intellectual circles. This approach backfired. When the prosecution demonstrated that Caleb's methods bore no resemblance to any credible scientific theory and were driven by sadistic pleasure rather than social philosophy, the prosecution's presentation of documentary evidence from Caleb's notebooks proved devastating to this defense strategy. His detailed descriptions of the pleasure he derived from torturing and killing children, combined with his elaborate fantasies about expanding his operation to broader populations, clearly showed that his actions were driven by sadistic impulses. Rather than any coherent social theory, the trial's most dramatic moment came when the prosecution presented Caleb's own words describing his ultimate goals for the selection program. In notes found among his personal effects, he outlined plans to establish similar institutions across Ohio and eventually the Midwest, creating a network of facilities that would systematically eliminate children deemed unfit for productive lives. His vision included detailed organizational charts, funding proposals, and strategies for recruiting like-minded individuals to assist in implementing his program on a national scale. The jury's deliberation lasted less than 4 hours, a remarkably short time for a case of such complexity. The unanimous verdict found all 3 defendants guilty on multiple counts of murder, as well as charges of fraud, child cruelty, and conspiracy. The speed of the decision reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the public's outrage at the defendants' crimes. Sentencing revealed disparities in the standards applied to men and women who erred. Judge Wickham sentenced Jeremiah and Caleb to death by hanging, stating that their crimes represented such a gross offense against civilized society that no other punishment could be just. Martha, deemed incompetent and under the influence of her male relatives, was sentenced to life imprisonment. Reflecting contemporary views of women's limited capacity for independent moral action, Jaramir's execution on September 12, 1857, drew thousands of spectators to Columbus, where public hangings regularly attracted large crowds. In his final speech from the gallows, he again attempted to justify his actions as necessary for social reform. Future generations will understand we were pioneers in improving the human condition, he declared. The weak must be culled, so the strong may thrive. Our only error was being born too soon. Caleb's execution, carried out the same day, stood in stark contrast to his father's philosophical posturing. His final words revealed the true nature of his motives. "I regret only that I was stopped before completing my work. The pleasure I took in their suffering was worth any punishment you could impose." These words, published in newspapers nationwide, helped frame the case as a landmark example of what would later be recognized as serial murder driven by sadistic pleasure rather than any rational purpose. Martha's imprisonment was short-lived, as her mental state deteriorated rapidly in Ohio's state women's prison. According to prison records, her days alternated between periods of catatonic silence and fits of rage during which she screamed about the children buried in the ground and begged forgiveness from voices only she could hear. She officially died in 1863 of pneumonia, though prison physicians noted she had essentially wasted away from an inability to eat or care for herself. The 20 children rescued from the Grimby basement required months of medical treatment and psychological care before they could be placed in legitimate orphanages or foster families. Dr. Tilton meticulously documented their recovery, producing one of the earliest systematic studies of trauma recovery in children. Some never fully recovered from their ordeal, suffering lifelong physical and emotional impairments. Margaret Henley, the 13-year-old whose testimony was pivotal in the trial, eventually recovered enough to be placed with a farming family in western Ohio. She lived to adulthood, married, and raised her own children. However, according to family records, she never spoke of her experience at the Grimby home after the trial. Her descendants, interviewed decades later, described her as a loving but fiercely protective mother who never allowed her children to be alone with adults outside immediate family. The aftermath of the investigation exposed alarming gaps in Ohio's oversight of charitable institutions, extending far beyond the Grimby case. A comprehensive review, ordered by the state legislature, revealed that dozens of similar institutions operated with minimal supervision, relying primarily on self-reporting and infrequent inspections conducted with advance notice. The Grimby case demonstrated how easily such a system could be manipulated by criminals willing to maintain appearances. Reforms enacted in response established new requirements for unannounced inspections, mandatory reporting of child deaths and foster placements, and verification of placement claims. Most critically, the new regulations mandated that institutions maintain detailed medical records for each child and immediately report any deaths or transfers to other facilities. Edmund Hartwell's role in exposing the crimes earned him recognition as a pioneer in forensic photography, but the experience took a heavy personal toll. His meticulous documentation of the excavations, the basement prison, and the condition of the rescued children provided critical evidence for the prosecution, but the images he captured haunted him for the rest of his life. In later interviews, he described the case as both his greatest professional achievement and his most traumatic personal experience. The photographic techniques Hartwell developed during the investigation set precedents for crime scene documentation that influenced law enforcement procedures across the Midwest. His systematic approach to recording evidence, measuring crime scenes, and creating comprehensive visual records became a model for other photographers working with law enforcement. However, the psychological toll of documenting such extreme cruelty led him to abandon forensic work entirely, returning to his original specialization in architectural and landscape photography. The Grimby home itself became an enduring reminder of the crimes committed there. The county seized the buildings and land as part of the criminal proceedings, but disposing of the property proved difficult. Locals refused to purchase land associated with such horrific crimes, and in 1858 the buildings were ultimately demolished, rather than preserved as monuments to the family's atrocities. Even after demolition, the site continued to unsettle residents. Hunters and travelers avoided the burial area, complaining of an overwhelming sense of dread when passing through, despite the bodies having been relocated to a proper cemetery. Local folklore grew around the site, with tales of strange sounds, and unexplained phenomena, though these likely reflected the community's trauma rather than anything supernatural. The graves of the murdered children were relocated to Woodland Cemetery in Medina, marked with simple stones bearing numbers rather than names. This decision reflected the grim reality that the killers had systematically erased many children's original identities. Despite the thoroughness of the crime documentation, Jeremiah deliberately obscured the victims' pasts to make their disappearances less noticeable. Community efforts to identify the murdered children continued for years after the trial, as families from across Ohio and neighboring states provided information about missing children who may have fallen victim to the Grimby operation. Some were successfully identified, allowing names to be added to the graves, but many remained anonymous. A final victory of the killer's systematic dehumanization. The case records, including Hartwell's photographs, the family's journals, and trial transcripts, were sealed in the county archive immediately after the executions. The decision to restrict access reflected society's desire to move past the traumatic events, but also hindered researchers from studying the case for potential insights into criminal psychology and institutional abuse. When the archives were finally unsealed in 1925, they provided historians and criminologists with an unprecedented wealth of information about serial murder and institutional abuse in the 19th century. The detailed records left by the Grimby family, combined with the systematic documentation of the investigation, offered unique insights into the psychology of familial criminal enterprises and the social conditions that allowed such crimes to go undetected. Modern analysis of the case has identified it as an early example of what criminologists now term institutional serial murder, crimes committed by individuals using their authority over vulnerable populations to select and kill victims over an extended period. The Grimby's methods, motivations, and psychological profiles became critical case studies in the development of criminal psychology and the understanding of how seemingly ordinary individuals can perpetrate extraordinary atrocities. The broader implications of the Grimby case extended beyond criminal justice, raising fundamental questions about society's responsibility for its most vulnerable members. The family's ability to operate undetected for 5 years, despite numerous red flags and opportunities for intervention, exposed systemic failures far beyond individual criminal behavior. Most disturbing was the revelation that the Grimbys' crimes were enabled not by their isolation from society, but by their successful integration into its social, religious, and political structures. Their respectability, charitable reputation, and apparent success in fulfilling their missions served as perfect cover for activities that contradicted every principle they claimed to uphold. This paradox raised uncomfortable questions about the relationship between public virtue and private conduct, resonating far beyond the case itself. The psychological profiles developed during the trial revealed patterns of behavior later recognized as characteristic of criminal family enterprises. Jeremiah's role as the ideological leader providing intellectual justification for the crimes. Martha's position as a coerced enabler whose acquiescence made the operation possible. And Caleb's function as the primary executioner deriving personal satisfaction from the violence demonstrated how family dynamics could be twisted to facilitate systematic evil. The case also shed light on the dangers of unchecked authority over dependent populations, particularly when combined with social isolation and inadequate oversight. The Grimbys' crimes were enabled by their absolute control over their victims, who had no means of communicating with the outside world or seeking help from authorities. This dynamic was later recognized as a common feature in cases of institutional abuse, leading to reforms aimed at ensuring vulnerable populations could maintain contact with independent advocates. The financial aspects of the case revealed another dimension of the family's criminal enterprise beyond the murders themselves. Investigation of their records showed they systematically defrauded both state agencies and private donors by claiming to care for children they had actually killed. Funds intended for the children's food, clothing, medical care, and education were instead diverted to support the family and finance their criminal activities. Even more disturbing was the discovery that the Grimbys sold the personal belongings of murdered children to merchants in distant cities, creating an additional revenue stream from their crimes. Clothing, jewelry, toys, and other items were systematically stripped from victims and sold as far away as Cincinnati and Pittsburgh, further concealing evidence of the crimes from local investigators. The legal precedent set by the case influenced criminal jurisprudence for decades, particularly regarding the use of photographic evidence and the prosecution of crimes committed within family units. The court's decision to accept Hartwell's photographs as evidence helped establish photography as a legitimate tool for documenting criminal activity. At the same time, the prosecution's success in securing convictions for all three family members demonstrated that familial ties did not exempt individuals from criminal accountability. Martha Grimby's sentencing, despite her evident mental instability and claims of coercion, set important precedents regarding the criminal liability of individuals who enable crimes through passive compliance or willful ignorance. Educational institutions began incorporating the Grimby case into training programs for social workers, institutional administrators, and state inspectors. The systematic failures that allowed the crimes to persist became a compelling lesson in the importance of rigorous oversight, independent verification of institutional claims, and the need for vulnerable populations to maintain contact with advocates outside their immediate caregivers. Religious communities across Ohio and beyond grappled with the implications of crimes committed by individuals who successfully posed as devout Christians engaged in charitable work. The case prompted uncomfortable reflections on how religious authority and charitable reputations could be manipulated to conceal criminal activity, leading to calls for greater transparency and accountability in religious organizations. The impact on child welfare policy extended far beyond Ohio, as other states conducted similar reviews in light of the Grimby revelations, reforming their own oversight systems. The case became a catalyst for nationwide reforms in institutional regulation, inspection procedures, and documentation requirements, improving protections for vulnerable children across the United States. Perhaps most significantly, the Grimby case served as an early warning about the capacity for evil to masquerade as virtue and the dangers of assuming charitable intentions automatically lead to charitable outcomes. The detailed documentation of how a respected family could systematically murder children entrusted to their care became a sobering reminder that society's most vulnerable members are often at greatest risk from those claiming to protect them. This mystery shows us how easily evil can disguise itself as charity and how society's most vulnerable often pay the price for our willingness to trust without verifying. The Grimby family's crimes were enabled not by their isolation from society, but by their successful integration into it, a reminder that the greatest horrors often lurk behind the most respectable facades. The systematic nature of their crimes, the calculated cruelty of their methods, and their complete lack of remorse force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the capacity for evil inherent even in those we trust most. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was uncovered? Could such systematic evil exist in our own communities today, hidden behind facades of respectability and charity? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want more like it, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share it with someone who loves a good mystery. See you in the next video.